Conservative estimates place the number of deaths from obesity and diet-related disease at around 112,000 Americans a year. Other credible estimates put this number at closer to 678,000. That's over 600,000 of your friends, your family members, your loved ones dying every single year from something that the experts tell us is largely preventable. 600,000 is a massive number. That's the entire city of Boston wiped out every single year. It's the entire state of Wyoming wiped off the map, gone, finished. That's more dead every year than American lives lost in all of the wars of the 20th century, combined, by a lot. And the craziest part of it all, despite seeing this trend, despite seeing this epic tidal wave of metabolic dysfunction, shortened lifespan, reduced quality of life over the last 50 years, the pace hasn't slowed. It's accelerated. It would seem that there is no end in sight. Until now. GLP-1 agonists like Wegovy, Mounjaro, and others have finally delivered on what 50 years of the gospel of eat less and move more have failed to do, with users of these drugs losing 5, 10, even 20% of body weight in a short amount of time, pretty much effortlessly. Has the pharmaceutical industry finally given humanity the ability to have its cake and to eat it too? Will GLP-1 agonists usher in a new era of human health, longevity, potentially eradicating diseases like type 2 diabetes and more? Or is there a dark side to these drugs? Welcome to another episode of Unconditional, a podcast in which we explore what it takes to reclaim radical health and fitness, build an unstoppable mindset, and create your most unlimited, unconditional life. My name is Norby Schickel. If you've been with me before, welcome back. It's good to have you again. If you're new to the show, and I have to assume that that is most of you, as this is a brand new show, it's a baby show, brand new, welcome to you too. It's good to have you. Today, we are talking one of the most important and controversial subjects within the health and fitness space. Isn't that all of our subjects? Everything we talk about is controversial and important. I'm going to say that all the time. But today, we're talking a new class of highly effective injectable weight loss drugs, referred to as GLP-1 agonists, or as many just simply refer to them as Ozempic. And while the term Ozempic is not exactly precise here, for reasons we'll get into, at least as of the time of this recording, these terms, GLP-1 agonists, injectable weight loss drugs, and Ozempic, are often used interchangeably within the context of this conversation. So we're going to use them. We're going to acknowledge that right from the start. I know it's not perfect, but we're going to make it happen. In this discussion, we're going to dive deep into the incredibly important stakes which frame the discussion around GLP-1 agonists. We're going to discuss how these drugs work, the benefits, the risks of taking GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro. And lastly, the bottom line, a question for you or your loved ones that you may be wondering. Should I take Ozempic for weight loss? Should I take a GLP-1 agonist for weight loss? These are the important questions. This is the crux of this conversation. Now, for this conversation, we're going to lean heavily on the work of a journalist named Johann. He is the author of a book called Magic Pill, The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs. Now, I've mentioned Magic Pill before and Johann in a previous episode, but this book is exceptionally well done. It's very readable, it's very enjoyable, and I'll confess some bias around this subject. I think it's fair. I think we're all entitled to having some preconceived notions, but Magic Pill truly did open my eyes to some very important aspects of this conversation that are often missed in this discussion, and frankly, I had missed in this discussion. I've said it before, but I would highly recommend going out and buying a copy of Magic Pill, and I'll add a link in the show notes, and do it. The book is incredible. It's like $12 on Amazon, right? If you're interested in this subject, and everybody should be interested in this subject, just do yourself a favor, get the copy. I will say this, the book Magic Pill is far, far more than what I initially thought. What I was expecting when I started looking for a book on this subject was a book that was largely about the drug Ozempic, right? And largely about the use of these injectable weight loss drugs, the risks, the benefits, the pros, the cons, that sort of thing. And truth be told, I expected that at this early stage in the game, what I would probably find was a book that was fairly pro use of these drugs, because that's what I've seen mostly online. And what I got was something incredible. It's this book that is incredibly nuanced about this conversation. Okay, Johann Hari does an unexpectedly, and maybe I'm not giving him as much credit here, but an unexpectedly good job, in my opinion, of really articulating the balance around this conversation. And at one point in time, I think it was an interview that he gave with Chris Williamson from the Modern Wisdom podcast. And he said something to the effect of that this book was different for him because in many of the other books that he's written before, he sort of leaves the reader with the conclusion, right? Based on what he knows about the subject, here's what one ought to conclude. But he said that with this book, he couldn't do that. And it's because the subject is just, it's too difficult to really wrap your arms around and present in a nice, neat package of here's what should be done, quote unquote. And that may be the reason that the book is incredible, right? First off, because he does an incredible job of sort of sharing both sides. And even that term, both sides, is a little complicated. There aren't really both sides. There's more than two sides to this conversation. But I think because of that, Hari does an incredible job. But I also think there's more to this book, more than I expected, way more than I expected. And that is that I think Hari accurately nails the problem, like what got us into this mess. He also nails, I think, many of the risks and benefits associated with injectable weight loss drugs, GLP-1 agonists, such as Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, etc. But he also, I think, lays out the solution to the obesity epidemic in the absence of these drugs. Now, we've said at the very beginning that we've had 50 years of eat less, move more, right? Calories in, calories out, law of thermodynamics. And it's no surprise to people who've been paying attention that for the vast majority of Americans, that hasn't worked. And I think Hari accurately describes not only why this hasn't worked, but he points to a situation where this advice actually does work. And to me, it's just incredible because I think he has it, right? I think he has it. Even how he grew up, it's wild. I've spent a good amount of time talking about Dr. Weston A. Price in this podcast and how Price traveled around to these 12 different regions approximately, studying people following a modern diet and a primitive diet. Well, one of these regions, and let me just say, and of course, what he discovers is the people who follow this primitive diet, a diet that we could just very quickly today say a whole foods, natural foods, real foods diet versus those that are on what would be described as a processed food diet, right? Maybe not ultra processed in the way that we have it today. Dr. Price did his work in the 1930s, but this is the choice, right? This is the dichotomy. This is the comparison. Those who are approximately the same genetic stock, those following a primitive diet, a traditional diet, a whole foods diet, and those following a modern processed diet. And their health outcomes are just 180 degrees diametrically opposed. Those following a whole foods diet, incredible health, robust health, great teeth, great skin, great hair, super tall. And those that are not, I mean, it's like a propaganda photo of the enemy in World War II, right? They're all shriveled, they're shrunken, their faces and skin is terrible, their teeth are, incredibly deformed, and it's everywhere Dr. Price goes. It's just an incredible book. I've done 2 episodes on Dr. Weston A. Price. I'll plug those episodes, check out those episodes, and check out the book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. It's an incredible book, right? Incredible book. Been around for almost 100 years. It'll be around for another 100, easy, because it's that important. It's that powerful. I've said this before, but I do believe it is the most important book written on nutrition and health ever. Full stop. Anyways, so why am I bringing up Dr. Weston A. Price other than the fact that I've just very, very much like his work. Well, Johann Hari tees up sort of his personal story in this book, and how in many ways his story could be seen sort of as a microcosm for this discussion and this debate. His father wound up immigrating, I guess, to the UK, and he marries his mother, who is Scottish. The mother has grown up on processed foods and convenience foods and using the microwave and doesn't know how to cook. Well, Johann Hari's father grew up in the Swiss Alps, the very first region that Dr. Weston A. Price introduces in his study of these 12 areas, right? These 12 geographies where he studies and takes some 15,000 photos of people following these traditional diets versus modern diets. So the very first region is the Swiss Alps, and that is where Johann Hari's father comes from. So he's coming from this tradition of farming and ruggedness and cooking and growing your own food. And all of a sudden he finds himself coming crashing into, the world of convenience and packaged foods in the UK in the 1970s, I believe. And it's just incredible. It's just incredible because he comes from one of these regions, and Hari does a very good job of explaining how this fight over food that his parents experienced, that his parents lived through, that, on the one hand, his mom, food is food. It's convenient. It's tasty. Everybody's doing it. What's the problem? And then on the other hand, you have his dad, who comes from this tradition, and his English isn't great, and he gets incredibly mad, and you can tell he's this incredibly flawed person. He doesn't have the words, and he has more savagery than civility, it would seem at times. And he's not particularly likable in making the case for whole foods. And then at the crux of it is his son, is Johann Hari's mom's son, which is Hari, Johann Hari, the author in this case. And the argument and the fight over this food in many ways is the microcosm. I find it incredibly sad that Hari's father was working as a chef, but then ultimately he just sort of gives in. He's just like, yeah, if you can't beat him, join him kind of thing. At least that's the idea that we get. And he embraces eating these processed foods, these modern foods, and his health suffers. And again, I just find that remarkable. I find it remarkable that of all the books, a book about injectable weight loss drugs, about GLP-1 agonists, it thoroughly wraps its head around the crux of the issue. Again, just mind-blowing. I can't recommend this book enough. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox and let's get into the crux of the matter. Let's get into the issue. Let's get into GLP-1 agonists. We have a lot to cover, and we're probably still going to leave some things unsaid. We're going to discuss the stakes, the importance of this issue, something that I'm always incredibly passionate about, right? I think this is the thing that's most often missed in conversations such as this. We're going to answer the question of how GLP-1 agonists work. Are GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro safe? What are the risks, both known and unknown, of injectable weight loss drugs? And the big question, the bottom line, should I take Ozempic or a similar GLP-1 agonist for weight loss? Those are the questions. So without further ado, let's get into the why, the stakes, the importance of this conversation. As I've said before, I am fascinated by context. I think I've probably always been that way, but in an age of viral videos, short-form clips, I feel like context is just the thing that is so often missing from the discussion. It's the thing that's most commonly missing from the discussion. And without context, without the stakes, it becomes much, much easier to demonize one side, to judge and misunderstand different points of view. So I always emphasize the context behind the conversation, and the context behind this conversation is incredibly important. I've teed this up as part of the introduction for this episode, so we've gotten some of the context, but we're going to dive even deeper here. Now, I'm not naive in assuming that if we all had the same handle on the facts or the context, we'd all come to the same conclusions. Not at all. Don't believe that. Humanity is a diverse tapestry, and I like it that way. But so often, our lack of understanding stems from a lack of understanding of the stakes, or, just the fact that we're going to weigh these stakes differently. And that's okay. And if there were a topic in which the stakes matter greatly to wrapping our heads around it, it is this one. It is the use of these GLP-1 agonists. The stakes at this moment are absolutely massive. And before we get into the question of whether these drugs work, whether they are safe, should my loved ones or myself take them, understanding the stakes as clearly as possible is of huge importance. Americans are dying at a terrifying rate from obesity and diet-related diseases. As I mentioned in the intro, credible estimates put this number at somewhere between 112,000 and 678,000 deaths every single year. It's the entire city of Boston. It's the entire state of Wyoming. It's insane because of the scope, but also because many of these deaths are not only premature, but many would argue preventable through lifestyle and dietary changes. As shocking as those numbers are, the death rate doesn't accurately describe the full impact here. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic dysfunction are strongly correlated with a higher rate of chronic illness, including arthritis, heart and mobility issues, as well as mental disorders, just to name a few. We are paying a price in lifespan for sure, but we're also paying it in health span and quality of life as well. And despite recognition of these numbers and trends for decades, the problem has only gotten worse. According to numbers cited in the book, in the 1970s, around 15% of the adult U.S. population was obese. That number sits around 40% today, a near tripling in 50 years. The picture of childhood obesity looks very similar, up from 5% in 1970 to around 20% today, nearly 4 times the rate. As I've said before, something is off. This is a major issue. According to some, this is the issue we are facing from the perspective of health, not just in America, but in almost the entirety of the developed world as well. Right? I agree. I think that this is the issue. And for as long as I've been alive, the best that the experts had to offer was diet and exercise. We're eating too much, we're moving too little. Calories in, calories out. The idea being that we as a society are just simply out of balance. It's the law of thermodynamics at work. The problem isn't the food. The problem is that you're eating too much of it. But that explanation always rang a bit hollow. There were always some things about that were odd about the diet and exercise story. Why such a steep rise in the obesity rate beginning in the 1970s? Also, for the first time in maybe all of recorded human history, a metabolic condition generally associated with overconsumption has hit the poorest and most vulnerable in our society the hardest. In other words, in the past, poverty would have been associated with starvation and deficiency, not excess and obesity. Something is off. I've said this in my episode before on Are We Better Off? But something is off. And while Hari casts a wide net, and there are certainly experts who would likely agree with the notion that the standard line of diet and exercise is at the root cause of the problem, that the problem is a lack of discipline, that it's a lack of willpower, I don't buy that. I don't buy it. And it's clear that Hari doesn't buy it either. He points to countries like Mexico after NAFTA, or Afghanistan after the terror war, in which each country was rapidly opened up to the modern global food supply and quickly experienced a sharp uptick in obesity and obesity-related illnesses, the same sorts of illnesses that we face in the United States, Britain, Canada, right? Many of the other quote-unquote developed world. Hari quotes a guy named Gerald Mand, who is an adjunct professor of nutrition at Harvard. And he says, quote, "There was no genetic shift that happened in the 1970s or 80s. There was no massive change of willpower that occurred. Yet all of a sudden, people started gaining weight rapidly." End quote. This guy's right. We're going to hear from this guy a lot because of all of the experts that Hari quotes in his book. I find myself when I look at something and I say, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's this guy. It's this guy, Gerald Mand. So kudos to him. He's got it on lock. Okay. So said simply, after 50 years of the gospel of diet and exercise and obesity rates have continued to climb, we need a better answer. We deserve a better answer. And the pharmaceutical industry, so often cast as both the hero and the villain in the drama of human health, was silent until now. With the discovery of GLP-1 agonists and the release of effective injectable weight loss drugs like Ozempic, the pharmaceutical industry has finally been able to speak up, and it's done so with a roar. In the words of Tim Spector, a professor of genetic epidemiology at King's College in London, these drugs are, quote, the holy grail that people have been seeking, end quote, for people with severe obesity. If what we're told about obesity is true, if the cause is an excess of calories consumed and a deficiency of movement and exercise, it would appear that with the introduction of injectable weight loss drugs like Ozempic, we now have a way to have our cake and eat it too. When you consider the scale of the crisis, the impact of these drugs is enormous. Let's consider some numbers from the book that illustrate the magnitude here. We've already discussed that 40% of adult Americans are now obese. But when you consider obese or overweight, right, both categories combined, that number shoots up to 70%. That's 2 out of 3. It's a super majority of Americans. You look at a graph that plots the obesity rate over time, and it's just a sharp rise. It's a sharp rise up and to the right. And the numbers in many ways actually look worse among our children, a group that historically had almost no obesity. Many people who are my age or older have pointed this out, that when they were growing up as kids, you almost never saw an obese kid. Now that number is 1 out of 5. It's 20% of our children are obese. In one survey referenced, quote, 47% of Americans said they would be willing to pay to take these drugs, end quote. And in the words of one expert quoted in the book, quote, within 10 years, 20 or 30% of the population will be on obesity drugs. There's no argument about that, end quote. Why is there no argument about that? Well, because they work. These drugs work, and they work quickly and dramatically. Hari tells us that users can expect to lose between 5 and 24% of their body weight. As long as they continue to use these drugs, and for the most part, they keep the weight off. Right? That is a miracle. That is miraculous. Novo Nordisk, the manufacturer of Ozempic, just one of these new class of drugs, has quickly become the most valuable company in Europe at the time of Hari's writing. Now, if this were only about aesthetics, if this were only about improved self-esteem, ability, quality of life, the potential benefits from these drugs would still be enormous. We should acknowledge that. While it's tempting to write off aesthetics as vanity or mobility as somewhat vague, I would encourage you not to make that mistake. These are incredible drivers on the quality of life. That being said, I do accept that the bigger fish here, the bigger potential benefit from the perspective of lifespan and chronic disease, is that the weight loss experienced by those on the drugs is accompanied by a decline in the disease patterns which are strongly associated with obesity. Right? That's the holy grail. That's the trifecta. If these drugs can promote the same sorts of improvements in health, the same sorts of improvements in biomarkers that we generally see when somebody experiences weight loss, sustained weight loss, manageable weight loss over a period of years, going from the category of obese to normal weight, when they go from being maybe out of shape to being in shape, then the potential for these drugs is enormous. The potential benefits to humanity are enormous. Is that possible? Is it likely? These are important questions that I don't know that anyone truly has a definitive answer to at this point. How do these potential benefits weigh against the known and potential risks of these drugs? And let's not be naive here. As is the case with any drug, there are risks. These, among other questions, are at the heart of the matter. Those are the stakes. This is the why for this episode. This is why this episode is so huge, and why I feel that we need to talk about it more. We should be incredibly excited about this, but we should also be going in very eyes open. Now, before we get into the heart of the matter, we've got to talk about what's not being said in this episode. That's a funny way to start, isn't it? Let's talk about what we're not saying. But in this case, I feel it is incredibly important. And it's incredibly important for reasons that, again, Hari helped illustrate and bring home in my mind. And that is that there's been an incredible amount of shame, judgment, and blame around this subject. There's this political pollster, this guy by the name of Frank Luntz. And don't worry, we're not going to get into politics here. But I guess you could best describe Luntz as a communications and messaging expert. His entire job was, and maybe still is, to help politicians craft their messaging so that their ideas would appeal to the widest possible audience. I'm not sure if this is still the case, but I know for a while he was sort of this kind of behind the scenes, kind of shadowy, not quite sure where his loyalties lie, but you want him on your side, sort of messaging mercenary, highly paid, worked for both sides, just Machiavellian, right? That sort of a guy. But he's got this great line. It's maybe more of an insight that always sticks with me. And it's not what you say, it's what they hear. It's actually the title of one of his books. But the fundamental insight here is that it's not what you say, it's what the person you are saying to hears. That messages are received imperfectly by different people, and that it is the job of the communicator, the message sender, to recognize and attempt to remedy this. And of course, the more emotionally charged the subject is, the greater likelihood that what is heard is going to be a lot different than what is said. I learned about Luntz way back in college. I studied rhetoric in college, and I was incredibly fascinated by this idea. It's probably still up, but there was this great documentary called The Persuaders. And in The Persuaders, they talk about, it was a PBS documentary, I should say. I think it was Frontline. And the documentary highlights certain persuaders, from marketing experts to political pollsters. And Frank Luntz is one of these guys that was featured, and he was sort of like this mysterious figure. I'm not sure if the documentary is still around, but it was worth the watch at the time. And what does that have to do with this episode? I recognize that there is a strong likelihood. No, it's more than that, actually. It's an inevitability that some people are going to hear something very different than what I'm saying. This subject is important. It's important to speak about, but there is a massive, massive emotional component here. It is in part through Hari's book that I've become more aware of the shame, judgment, blame, and prejudice that surrounds the conversation on obesity, metabolic dysfunction, and even chronic illness. Hari goes through many examples in the book, and some of them are incredibly hard to read, of people being shamed for their weight, oftentimes by doctors. Maybe you could say that these are people that quote unquote mean well. But like one example, and I've talked about this before, really stands out to me. It's a woman who is overweight or obese, goes into the doctor, and she's asking about the prospect of becoming pregnant, right? A very normal, very common thing that a young woman might be asking her doctor about. And instead of offering, sort of guidance or insights as to how she could do it in a healthy way, the guy basically says something to the effect of, well, that's not something you're ever going to have to worry about because no one's ever going to want to get you pregnant. And for some reason, maybe it's just because I have young kids, that just boiled my blood to read that this expert, that this guy who should be promoting health thinks that it's not only his right, but it's somehow his obligation to say something so horrific, to say something so hurtful to a person. Shame doesn't work. It doesn't work. Even if it did work, it would just be wrong. I've said this before, but what kind of society do we want to live in? Certainly not that one. I think Hari correctly points to the shame, the prejudice, the feelings that many people experienced that directly led to the fat pride movement. And that was sort of a tip far in the other direction. Also not great. But still, it's important to point this out, that in this conversation, Nothing that I say is coming from the perspective of shame. Nothing that I say is coming from the perspective of blame. I've been there. We've been there. I've had many of my own health challenges with respect to weight gain, with respect to food addiction. So again, there is no blame here. And truly, because it's not your fault. It isn't your fault. And more importantly, weight is not a moral issue. I'll say this again. Weight gain, obesity, being overweight, metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, all of these terms that get thrown around, there is zero, not a one iota of moral weight behind any of this. It's just not a moral consideration. There's no moral consideration here. It doesn't make you a good person if you're of a, quote, normal weight. It doesn't make you a bad person if you are obese. It doesn't. It's just a neutral thing. It's like eye color. It's like hair color from the perspective of morality. Now, can we say it might improve the quality of a person's life? Maybe. And I say maybe because individual choices are highly subjective. But I find it incredibly important to just emphasize and overemphasize and just pound the point home. There is no moral consideration here. There's just none. So from my perspective, and I'll bang this drum as loudly as I possibly can, there's no shame. There's no moral consideration with anything here. No good, no evil. Okay? We're talking about effective, not effective from this narrow perspective of obesity and weight loss. Full stop. That's it. Okay, let's get into one of the most important questions. Do these drugs work? How do these drugs work? In a word, yes. They appear that they work remarkably well for most people. Hari says that in the clinical trial for Novo Nordisk, people who were on the drug for 68 weeks, quote, lost an average of 15% of their body weight, compared to just 2.4% who had been given the placebo. This meant that it was officially the most successful weight loss drug in history, end quote. So the numbers are massive in the trial. 15% is significant. At 200 pounds, that's 30 pounds in a little over a year. Okay, that is a huge number. Although I will say 2.4% weight loss in the placebo group, it does have my spidey sense tingling a little bit. That does strike me as odd. Just given the trajectory that most Americans are on, which is to get heavier over year, right? 2.4% loss tells me something else is going on here. I don't know exactly what that is. I haven't dug into the trial in detail, but my spidey sense is tingling. I don't know if they pursued some dietary interventions, some exercise programs at the same time. But even though that number is different, even though it's a 5x between the placebo group and the trial group and the intervention, that still strikes me as odd. I'll just say that. But let's get back to the question at hand. Do these drugs work? Yes, in the trial, and yes, in the real world. Is a reduction in 15% of body weight realistic? The number that stands out to me is one that I've seen Hari discuss a few times, which is that patients can expect to lose 5 to 24% of their body weight within a few months of being on the drugs. Now that begs the obvious question. What happens if patients stop taking the drug? Will they gain the weight back? And according to both Hari and the drug companies themselves, in short, yes. More than likely, patients will gain the weight back. Hari says, quote, for the medication to work, you have to take it forever. It's not like taking a drug to treat malaria where there's a course and then it's done and you're cured. It's like taking statins to lower your cholesterol levels or blood pressure tablets. You have to keep using it or lose the effect. End quote. Okay, so you got to keep taking them. It is an intervention that is required for as long as the benefits are to be received. Does that mean that they're not worth taking? Not necessarily, but it does mean that we should go in eyes open here. We are, for the most part, talking about a lifetime of pharmaceutical intervention. And the calculus for somebody who's 16 is going to be dramatically different than the calculus for somebody who is 60, right? Going to be hugely different. Now, who should care about these drugs? In short, I've made this case, all of us, we should all care whether we're considering use of these drugs or not, for reasons that are fairly obvious at this point, both for the scale of the challenge that we're facing from a health perspective, but also how widespread these drugs have already become. And it's likely that we're only in the early stages, right? This is early innings here. It's likely that these drugs will become much, much more widespread. Okay. So how do GLP-1 agonists actually work? In short, these drugs work by acting on our gut chemicals, our gut hormones. These hormones are responsible for signaling satiety or the feeling of being full within the brain and body. Okay, so these gut hormones are responsible for giving us the sensation that we've eaten enough. Hari describes the feeling of being on these drugs by saying something to the effect of, it feels as if you've eaten a full Thanksgiving dinner with all the trimmings, and then someone comes in and offers you another meal. It's a feeling of fullness that is almost sickening. Hunger tells us it's time to eat. Satiety tells us it's time to stop. What these drugs are doing is giving you the feeling that you are much, much more full than you've felt in the past. It's ramping up the satiety signal. It's crushing down the hunger signal. Now, this is obviously a 50,000-foot view here. Hari goes much deeper on the mechanism, and there's some very fascinating history of how these gut chemicals were discovered, how these gut hormones were discovered. There's a Gila monster involved. There are multiple researchers involved. But again, we got to pick and choose. And in the interest of time, I'll say this. Grab a copy. Grab a copy of Magic Pill. Grab 2 copies and give one away. It's just a very, very good read and goes much, much deeper into the mechanism than I'm going to do now. And the reason for that is I would like to focus on a more philosophical question, because I believe the answer to this question is at the core of how we got here, but it's also at the core of an approach to sustained weight loss in the absence of these drugs, which will be the topic of next week's episode. Hint, hint. Hit the subscribe button. You don't want to miss it. We're going to talk today a lot about Ozempic, GLP-1 agonists. We're going to talk a lot about all the subjects that I laid out. However, it would be a mistake to not then discuss an alternative for people who maybe think that GLP-1 agonists are not right for them. And we'll get into who some of those people are. I'll offer my humble suggestions, my humble bro advice, not medical advice, but just bro advice, friend advice on people who these drugs may not be the right choice for, or certainly may not be the right first choice. Okay. So instead of focusing deep on the mechanism, I'd like to focus on this philosophical question. It's a more interesting question to me. And that is, do these drugs artificially induce satiety? Do they promote a super physiological feeling of satiety? Or, as has been suggested by some, do these drugs restore signaling that has somehow been broken prior to this point? Right? So are these drugs restoring sort of this natural balance, this natural order of things? Or are they promoting this super physiological feeling of satiety? And to me, the answer to this question, and there may be more than one answer, but the answer to this question is of huge importance. I think there is a case to be made for the idea that the satiety signal for many people who are obese or overweight has been broken. That there are some people who can eat and will never get a feeling of fullness, which obviously leads to overconsumption and obesity. You get the point. Hari does make this case, and he cites a few experts who share this point of view. But if this is the case, if our satiety signals have been broken, if the improper functioning of the satiety signal is at the issue, what caused the issue in the first place? How is it that so many people, particularly in the developed world, hint, hint, have had their satiety wrecked? What happened? What went wrong? And unlike some parts of the book where Hari is unsure, where he sort of presents both sides, in this instance, he's clear. He knows the answer. He tells us the answer directly. What has broken our satiety signal? Ultra-processed foods. And there's a smile on my face because I find this remarkable. As I said from the very beginning, within this book is all, and I mean all, that is required to understand the cause of and the solution to the obesity, metabolic dysfunction, and chronic illness epidemic. Is it laid out in the form of a straightforward thesis with supporting arguments and evidence? No, it isn't. But it's all there. It's all here. And this is a good example of what I mean. So how is it that ultra-processed foods undermine satiety signals and drive overconsumption? Hari lays out 4 ways. And very succinctly, they are that you chew ultra-processed foods less. 2, they generally contain this combination of fat and sugar, which is not found in nature. 3, they cause glucose spikes. And 4, they are generally lacking in protein and fiber. Okay, now while I don't agree with Hari's description of the mechanism by which ultra-processed foods disrupt our satiety signals, I do think that he is right to place the blame squarely at the feet of ultra-processed foods. If you're interested in a lengthier discussion of why I don't buy the quote-unquote unnatural combination of sugar and fat is what's driving this overconsumption idea, I encourage you to check out my previous episode. I think it's titled something to the effect of Are We Better Off? And that is episode number 7. Okay, I've heard many people say this, including people that I think have some important things to say, and some people that I think have an important perspective on human health. But I am convinced at this point that this argument isn't correct, that it's this unnatural combination of sugar and fat. And you hear this said a lot in the context of ultra-processed foods, right? That there's this hyperpalatability, there's this unusual combination that we just never experienced in nature. And now that we have these foods that we never had, we just get hit with them and we can't help ourselves. We just overconsume. Here's what Magic Pill has to say on the subject. Quote, "The second way our satiety is being undermined is that these manufactured foods often contain that uniquely powerful combination of sugar, fat, and carbs. And this seems to activate something primal in us. We go crazy for it in a way that we don't for other kinds of food." End quote. Okay, that's what I mean. Think about the language. We go crazy for it. Primal in us, right? Sounds unholy. He goes on to cite a doctor from Cambridge. I believe the name is Dr. Giles Yao. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. But he says here that, quote, "likely only one foodstuff available in abundance in nature, where you, quote, have carbs and fats naturally mixed together as a unit, and it's breast milk. This is the first food almost all of us consume. It soothes us. As a species, humans don't access this seemingly unique sugar-fat combo after we've been weaned. Until now. So we lap it up like an infant at the breast and gorge." End quote. Okay, now that's an incredible line. It's an incredible visual. And at first blush, it does seem that there's some logic to it. Like, when do we see this combination of fat and sugar? And you start thinking, like, is it steak? No. Is it fruit? No. Yeah, typically these foods they either have one or the other. They typically don't have both. But then if you give it a little bit more thought, the answer is obvious. Well, it's milk, right? Just remove the breast part. And I've said this before. Humans have consumed dairy, milk from domesticated cows, sheep, goats, and even horses for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it never, ever drove an obesity epidemic. In fact, I pointed this out before, but the traditional diet of the Maasai, a tribe in Central Africa, consists primarily of milk. Many people, from Dr. Weston A. Price in the 1930s to contemporary researchers today, have studied and commented on the phenomenal health outcomes of the Maasai. They are anything but obese. Just, when you have a minute, look up a photo of a traditional Maasai man or woman, and many of them still follow their traditional diet today. They're all lean, they're all athletic, great teeth, phenomenal skin. Okay? It is not this unusual combination of sugar and fat. I say that with confidence. Are sugars and fats part of many ultra-processed foods? Yes. Is that the core of the issue? No, it just isn't, right? Many, many societies, including the Swiss, right, where Johann Hari's father came from, what was their diet? this diet that promoted this incredible health and wellness, it was 6 days a week. Yes, that's it. 6 days a week of bread and cheese, a large glass of milk, and 1 day a week of meat, limited vegetables, limited other foods, right? Their primary diet consisted of freshly ground rye bread. And I've talked about this in my episode on Western A. Price, freshly ground rye bread and a whole lot of dairy, a whole bunch. Okay. And many, many other groups that are in the book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Dr. Weston A. Price, consume huge amounts of milk and they never got fat. Okay. Something else is going on. Something else is at work here. But I will say this, whether Hari or Yao have the exact mechanism correct is probably not the most important thing. I do think that the issue is ultra-processed foods. For some reason, our bodies do not appear to register satiety in the same way after consuming these foods as is the case with whole natural foods. There are many potential reasons here, right? It's been pointed out, and we'll dive deep on this in the future, that after tobacco companies saw the writing on the wall and they knew that they were eventually going to sort of be legislated out of existence in the 90s, they pivoted and the largest tobacco companies bought food companies. And all those same clever scientists that figured out ways to make cigarettes more addictive, more tasty, appeal to younger people. But all those same companies took those same scientists and turned them loose on food. And I think the results speak for themselves. Ultra-processed foods have become hyper-palatable. And is that surprising when the same industry that gave us cigarettes and flavored cigarettes and all these other things that just, tricked the chemical signaling in our brain, I think it's fair to say, got turned loose on food? It's not surprising at all. That's one reason. And again, like I said, we'll just touch on it here. We'll throw that out there. We'll tease you for the next episode, a future episode, because the next episode we already talked about what we're talking about. But at some point in time in the future, we're going to go deep on that. But there's another issue here, and Hari references the work of Susanna Holt. She's an Australian researcher who tried to answer this question: which foods make you feel full? And in what may not come as a surprise to many of us by now, but likely did come as a surprise to many when she performed this work back in 1995, Hari says, quote, she found one type of food makes you feel full very fast. Whole foods. The kind my dad grew up eating. Things like steak, potatoes, fresh fruit, fish. You eat them, you have enough, and you want to stop. On the other end of the spectrum, she found that a different kind of food really doesn't make you feel full for long. Most processed foods, the kind I grew up eating, Hari here, biscuits, boxed cereals, cakes, flavored yogurts, croissants. You eat them and you want more and more and more, end quote. Okay, so one, impressive how I can say croissant the way that I can. I've been to France, once. But that being said, this is the difference, right? I mean, and I said, this book, incredible. I pulled out selective quotes here, but Hari, he lined up the target and he hit it. He didn't hit it in this, nicely laid out thesis, anything like that. But within this book are just the seeds of the entire answer. This is one of the reasons why I just continue to wax rhapsodic about the book. Okay, so regardless of the mechanism, there is something about ultra-processed foods. They don't make us feel full. Or the hyperpalatable taste encourages us to eat more and more. And just bookmark this in your brain. Because for next week, when we talk about this, it's going to become incredibly important. Whole foods, hint, hint, whole foods. So let's circle back up here. Satiety signaling, the primary mechanism of GLP-1 agonists. Is it likely that the body's natural satiety signal has been disrupted? I think so. I think Hari makes a very strong case here, and it's one that I agree with. For some people, their satiety signaling has been disrupted. Maybe even for a lot of people, right? We've all consumed ultra-processed foods. Their satiety signaling, our satiety signaling, has been disrupted. And GLP-1 agonists may be acting in essence to bring them back into balance, to bring them back into proper functioning. One piece of nuance, though, is that to my knowledge, there is no measurement that is associated with these gut chemicals. So I think it's fair to say that we are making some assumptions here, based on descriptions of subjective feelings of fullness. But me personally, I am willing to accept this idea for now. I'm willing to say that I believe that there is enough evidence to say that our satiety signaling has been disrupted and that these drugs, at least at the doses that are being prescribed now, it's likely that they're bringing them back to a normal range. I think that this is probably right. But because this is subjective, because the feeling of fullness is subjective, this does lead us to a major issue, a major cause for concern with these drugs. And that is, if there is no objective measurement, if there's no way to measure somebody's levels, bring them to that level, and then cut it off, well, can these drugs go farther? Can these drugs push somebody's satiety signaling up so far that they might get into a, you could say, super physiological range? Could somebody crush their appetite down so low that this drug goes from helpful to harmful? Right? Even if we just take for a second that these drugs are helpful, and we'll get more into that. And I think the obvious question is, well, yes. Yes, they can. That to me is a major issue. These drugs ramp up the feeling of satiety essentially in anyone, or at least anyone they're effective with. It looks to me like they will likely crush the feeling of hunger and flood the body with a feeling of fullness, whether a person is severely obese, looking to lose 10 pounds for a wedding, or severely anorexic. If these drugs are able to provide a feeling of super physiological fullness, which it would appear that they can, it's not a question of if these drugs will be abused by those with eating disorders, but when and to what degree. And Hari gets this too. He first learns about these drugs not from doctors, not from researchers or formerly obese patients. No, he doesn't. He first learns about these drugs at a party attended by celebrities, actors, and movie directors. Thin people, glamorous people, looking to become even thinner and even more glamorous. That is a very, very different story. And I don't think it's controversial to suggest that teenagers are particularly prone to imitate celebrities and are particularly vulnerable to eating disorders. I think it's fair to say that this is the number one concern regarding these drugs in Hari's mind with respect to society in general, and I completely agree with this view. I've said from the very beginning, this is an issue that we should all care about. We all have children, nieces, nephews, friends, and loved ones who will come face to face with these drugs at a vulnerable time in their lives. And if the only thing standing between a young person who discovered the most obvious, most powerful means of accelerating eating disorders, and the only thing standing in their way is a doctor's prescription, we should all be very, very concerned. At the time of writing Magic Pills, these drugs had not been approved for use in children, and the cost is prohibitively high for somebody without insurance. In most cases, I think Hari says something like $800 to $1,200 US. When I looked it up, it looks like the cost of these drugs may have gone even further up. But as of this recording, at least 4 drugs have been approved for use in children, non-adults. And with more approved drugs that are coming to market, I think it's only a matter of time before the cost of these drugs come down. Let's not be naive here. These drugs are here, just like Adderall or anabolic steroids or opioids. Use of this drug will 100%, without a shadow of doubt, spread beyond those with a legitimate health need. They already have. Whatever your feelings about these drugs, good, bad, not sure, we should all really, really wrap our heads around this and start looking for the early signals. While we're on the subject, let's talk safety. In my view, Hari offers a very balanced view of both the potential benefits of GLP-1 agonists along with the risks associated with these drugs. Now, we won't dive deep into each one of these. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record. I'm going to say that all the time because the book is so incredible and there's so many things to cover. But Hari outlines, I believe it's 10 risks that he thinks should be considered heavily against the benefits of these drugs. And again, I'll just plug the book here because I'll continue to plug the book. Grab it, read it. You're going to love it. I'm going to give you a quick summary, though, of those 10. And then we're going to dive a little deeper. Actually, we're going to dive much deeper into 3 risks that I believe are of critical importance. We've already talked about one a little bit, which is the risks around accelerating eating disorders, but there are 2 more in my mind that deserve special mention. Okay, so the full summary list, the full 10 list that Hari outlines. Oh, okay, the first one, Ozempic face. Now, if you've been online and you've seen anything with respect to Ozempic or GLP-1 agonists, you hear about Ozempic face or Ozempic butt, right? There's 1 and 2. That, yes, when you experience a dramatic loss of weight, some people can experience some sagginess in their face, some sagginess in other areas that once held, let's just be honest, more fat, right? So more tissue. And that is something that can happen with other forms of rapid weight loss, whether it comes from the form of diet or whether it comes from, say, gastric bypass surgery. This may be a major issue in your mind. This may be a minor issue in your mind. But people should go in knowing that this is a possibility. The third, thyroid cancer safety signal. Okay, so this to me is obviously more serious in my view than something like a saggy face or less tissue in the gluteus region. But as we get later into the podcast, we're going to talk about one major issue with respect to the brain, but I'm going to tease the issue right now. The issue is that we talk about GLP-1 agonists and GLP-1 hormones as something that exists in our gut, right? That something primarily affects satiety signals. That's not true. That's very naive. It does affect gut hormones. It does affect feelings of satiety. The issue is that GLP-1 is actually made in the brain, and you have GLP-1 receptors throughout your entire body in multiple organ systems, not just in your stomach and GI tract. It's in your brain, kidney, liver, and your thyroid. And what is alarming for some is the fact that there has been a safety signal associated in experiments that shows an increased risk of thyroid cancer in rats. The way Hari concludes is probably what I'll leave you with for today, which is if thyroid cancer is something that runs in your family, you probably want to seriously consider whether these drugs are right for you. I've heard anecdotal reports of people getting prescribed these drugs in like a weight loss clinic with a very, very low bar to entry, right? Nobody's talking about BMIs or measuring waist or anything like that. People are being prescribed these drugs basically if they want them. Now, if that's the case, then it's also likely that the risks associated with these drugs are not commonly being discussed. This is a big one, in my opinion. If you or anybody in your family has any issues related to the thyroid, I would be concerned about this. The other area is increased risk of pancreatitis. That's number 4. 9 times more likely to experience an infection of the pancreas. Again, another source of GLP-1 receptors is in your pancreas. Increased risk of stomach paralysis. It's over 3.5 times more likely, according to one study. This is essentially where your digestion, from what I understand, just stalls. This is not a good thing. Can it be reversed? I think in some cases, in many cases it can. I think Hari talks about a woman who this happened to, and she stopped using the drugs and the condition resolved. Loss of muscle mass, right? If you're a hypertrophy guy, if you're a just gotta live bro kind of a guy, and no judgment, I'm maybe one of those guys. I don't know. Maybe 1 foot in. Yeah, maybe a 1.5 foot in. But loss of muscle mass is a real concern, and it's not just an aesthetic concern. Many people have pointed to the importance of preserving and ideally growing muscle mass as you age. And at least as far as I can tell, a huge group of the population that is using these drugs for weight loss are people that are gonna age, right? We're all gonna age, but middle-aged people are many of the people who are using these drugs. So the idea that you're combining the loss of fat with a loss of muscle mass should be considered heavily, right? Getting to a point of sarcopenia, fragility as we age, we don't want that. Are there ways in which you can combat that if you are on these drugs or if you're considering taking these drugs? Well, of course, right? But going in knowing that this is a possibility is of huge importance, huge importance. 7, malnutrition. I'm going to just say it because I want to talk a little bit more about what this means to me. It's kind of one of my risks, although I highlight nutrient deficiencies as something as a maybe subclinical, less obvious than malnutrition, but that's something I'm definitely going to want to talk about. So we'll just bookmark that. 8, the inability for pharmaceutical companies to keep up with demand. This is a risk, as I mentioned. Once you're on these drugs, in order to continue to get the effect, you have to stay on these drugs. And because these drugs have been an absolute blockbuster, as I mentioned, Novo Nordisk became fairly quickly the most valuable company in all of Europe, one of the first makers of these drugs, Ozempic. There's a chance that you might be left without the drug, which leads us to risk number 9, which is people, and it's a related risk, people sourcing these drugs from the black market or off-brand or bootleg drugs. And this is a real thing. This is absolutely happening. It's already happening. And we should watch for this because, at least according to one report that I saw, some people who have sourced these drugs from, say, compounding pharmacies, some of them are just getting nothing, and maybe that's the best case scenario. But others are getting something that really isn't the drug that they think that they're getting. And given that you're injecting yourself with these or injecting a loved one with these, my opinion is you really want to know that what you're getting is the right thing, is the real deal. Okay, and then 10 is this unknown unknowns. Some issues may take years or even decades to show as an issue. And an example that Hari points to, one researcher points to, is antipsychotic drugs. These drugs were introduced in the 1950s, but it took decades to recognize that there was an increased risk of diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia that are strongly associated with the prolonged use of antipsychotic medications. That wasn't known at the beginning. It couldn't be known at the beginning, right? And we are in the very, very early stages of these drugs. Is it likely that there are risks that have yet to be uncovered? It's inevitable, right? The risk profile for these drugs, I feel very confident saying, is much greater than what is understood today. Just going to happen, right? With more people using them, more information is going to be uncovered. Okay, and then the last one, I'm not sure if Hari actually points this out as a risk or if it's just its own chapter, but that's the impact of these drugs on the brain. When I first heard about these drugs, weight loss drugs, I had heard about it years ago, and the context that I understood these drugs in is they have this strange effect where drugs in the past almost inevitably, almost always, had a strong safety signal for suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation. So when I first heard about these injectable weight loss drugs, that's immediately where my head went. I immediately thought, what about suicide? What about suicidal ideation? And it turns out, yes, there are other people, not surprisingly, who have the same concern. And this is one of the major things that companies are looking at to ensure that these drugs are safe, right? To ensure that the signal has been addressed. Okay, now we've already touched on one of the big ones, the risk that these drugs accelerate the incidence of eating disorders and self-harm. And I've said this before, but to me, this is the number one risk from a societal standpoint. It's not if these drugs will be used and abused for people without a legitimate need for them, but when and to what extent. And social media and this hyper-connected world that we live in will make the problem even worse. Unlike other drugs that had been released in the past, other weight loss drugs, fen-phen and others, we now have social media. We now have this incredible ability to look and compare. And I think that it's uncontroversial to say that it's going to make this problem even worse. And again, if you think that the need for a prescription is what's going to keep this out of the hands of people who would abuse them, I refer you to the opioid epidemic, anabolic steroids, and Adderall, just to name a few. As the case with most drugs that have the potential for abuse, you don't solve the problem by only focusing on the supply side or the demand side. You have to focus on both. Okay, number 2, risk of malnutrition, and I'm adding nutrient deficiency. To me, this is a big one. And this would be an area of slight disagreement with Hari with respect to the relative risk here. Right? Hari does a great job. I think he does an amazing job with his book. But on this particular issue, I have I weight this one a bit higher than Hari probably does. Historically, obesity and weight gain was associated with excess abundance, with an overconsumption of nutrients. But we're living in this incredible time where things have flipped. Obesity is much more strongly associated with poverty and lower socioeconomic status than the inverse. And Hari, in my view, has correctly and accurately pinned the blame on ultra-processed foods. Yep, nailed it. But these foods are not associated with high nutrient density. They're associated with the opposite. Right? So wrap your head around that. Calorie rich, perhaps, but nutrient poor. Without a change in eating pattern, simply eating less of the same nutrient poor foods is going to make the problem worse. It's a recipe for disaster. There may be some obvious signals. Is it likely that we'll see a return of scurvy or rickets, right? A vitamin C and vitamin D deficiency, respectively? Maybe not. I think it's likely that we'll catch the obvious ones, but less obvious ones, subclinical deficiencies that result in and impact our hormones, loss of muscle mass, reduced cognitive function as we age, B vitamins, etc. These are the questions that I would have. And I do think that it's likely. And I think that it's likely because, from what I understand, and my read of this situation is that most of us are deficient in these nutrients today based on our diets. So to me, the idea that we're simply eating less of the same, I'll say it, terrible foods, yeah, nutrient deficiencies would be a huge concern in my mind. Getting regular blood work done would be a minimum. But keep in mind, this is an evolving space, and we don't know what we don't know. Think about something like folate or B12. Maybe less of an issue if there's a slight deficiency in a 70-year-old woman. But what about a pregnant woman or a couple trying to conceive? Right? Folate, from what I understand, only recently was discovered to have this significant role in preventing neural tube defects. Right? This is a recent phenomenon. This is something that we're recently discovering. Think about the effects of our microbiome, a conversation that wasn't being had 50 years ago. If you go back to the time of, say, Dr. Weston A. Price, which wasn't that long ago, it was about 100 years ago, only a handful of vitamins had been discovered at that point in time. This is definitely evolving space. So getting blood work done, getting regular blood work done, in my view, would be a minimum. But keep in mind, we don't know what we don't know. So I'll just leave it at that. Okay, risk number 3, suicidal thoughts and the impact that GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic have on the brain. Now, I said that the potential to accelerate eating disorders was my number one concern from the perspective of society. The potential impact of these drugs on the brain is my number one concern from the perspective of the individual, right? Even higher than the potential, the inevitability, in my opinion, for nutrient deficiencies. But the impact on the brain, to me, is the biggest risk. Now, my understanding of the history of weight loss drugs prior to Ozempic, as I mentioned, is that they have this odd pattern of suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, and even suicide, sadly. When I first heard about the approval and authorization of these drugs, that is where my mind went to immediately. Will we see a signal for suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts? I do know that the FDA did a study, I believe it was in 2024, and looked at this based on some early reports of suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation. Now, obviously, are there cases of suicide throughout the human population? Okay, yes, of course. Sadly, there are. But is it higher than, say, the background rate? At least according to the FDA at this point in time, or at least at the time of this study, no, not a cause for concern. Something to monitor, but not a cause for concern. Does that mean there's no risk? No. Does that mean that we won't see a signal in the future? No. But this is a known issue with older anti-obesity medications. So it's something that we should definitely keep in mind. What I did not know is that this is a signal that can also be observed in those who have successfully undergone bariatric surgery, right? Gastric bypass surgery. Absolutely insane. I had no idea. That at least according to Hari, after undergoing successful bariatric surgery, risk of suicide actually increases by quite a lot. I don't know that there's a definitive answer as to why this is the case, but theories range from a loss of joy from food to an unknown gut-brain connection that was somehow disrupted by the surgery. It's an incredibly fascinating idea. It's obviously a sad idea, but it's fascinating. And it's something that, again, I just had no idea about. Now, why would that be the case? And again, there are a couple of proposed answers here which may overlap with the potentiality with GLP-1s or other future potential weight loss drugs. That being said, there still are major reasons that there are concerns regarding the impact of these drugs on the brain. And the most obvious reason, again, this might be somewhat shocking, it was shocking to me when I read it, is that GLP-1, the real version, the biological version that your body creates, right? Not the GLP-1 agonist that's synthesized in a lab, but GLP-1 is not made in the gut. It's made in the brain. And although we refer to GLP-1 as a gut hormone, it is made in the brain. And GLP-1 receptors can be found all over the body, including in the brain, but also in the pancreas, stomach, heart, blood vessels, kidneys, as well as liver and fat cells. Okay, so essentially all over. And GLP-1 and GLP-1 receptors play a different role in different parts of the body, not merely signaling satiety. It's not just about appetite. So that's very significant in my mind. The GLP-1 agonists, the long-lasting, the synthetic versions of the hormone made in your body, they bind to the same GLP-1 receptor sites through multiple organ systems in the body, including in your brain. Now, what's the impact of this higher amount, right? This, what I would describe as a super-physiological amount of man-made GLP-1, right? Of these GLP-1 agonists. What's the impact of this much longer-lasting version when bound to these other GLP-1 receptor sites? We know that it has the effect, at least in the majority of cases, of crunching down appetite, of signaling satiety. But we do know that it is definitely having that effect. What other effects is it having? I think these are very important, very early questions, but I think these, in my view, are the number one risk associated with taking these drugs on an individual level, is that we just don't know. And again, another issue that Hari has discussed here, but is rarely discussed in conversations regarding the safety of these drugs. Okay, there's still so much to cover. Like I said from the very beginning, this topic is very important. And I do want to talk about addiction and anhedonia, right? Both related to this whole concept of the impact of GLP-1 on the brain. Now, I just highlighted a couple of potential risks here, a couple of unknowns. Well, let's talk specifically about some things that we do have some evidence for, and some things that maybe we do know, or at least we know with a higher degree of certainty. So up until now, we've spoken about the context of these drugs with respect to weight loss. But there's another area that these drugs are showing early potential promise, and that's a potential treatment for addiction. Early stages for sure, but there is clearly a link between GLP-1 and dopamine, and it would appear that in some cases, users of GLP-1 agonists have reported a reduction in other, you could describe as maybe harmful, maybe less than ideal habits, such as drug and alcohol use, online gambling, and even compulsive shopping. It would seem that while on the drugs, users get less of a hit from these activities as they once did prior to taking the drugs. And I think that this would make sense, right? Many users of GLP-1 agonists, like Ozempic, report a loss of enjoyment in food. But what if that loss, right, that reduction in enjoyment wasn't just about food? What if it also could be experienced with respect to other things like gambling, right? Drugs, alcohol. There were some studies that Hari references with respect to rats, where I think it was something like the rats that were on GLP-1s, especially the heavy users of alcohol. I won't go into the mechanism of how they determine this, but the heavy users of alcohol reduced their alcohol consumption by like 60% while on the drugs. So that could be very, very significant. Now, if this is not only limited to something like appetite in food, we get into this remarkable dichotomy between the potential benefit and the potential risk of these drugs. Again, these receptors are everywhere, and these hormones, in general, normally, naturally, are very short-lived, like gone in minutes, hours. But the synthetic versions, right, these GLP-1 agonists, they're designed to last for days and weeks. Again, what's the impact? We don't know. I think it's fair to say that the jury is still out, but some believe that this may explain the risk around suicidal thoughts, right? So we're going all the way back up again. Rather than losing interest in something specific and harmful, such as maybe overeating or gambling, these drugs may promote a loss of interest in general and a loss of enjoyment in life, a condition referred to as anhedonia, right? The opposite of hedonism, the opposite of hedonic anhedonia, without joy. In fact, Hari interviews and cites multiple researchers who cite this as the primary concern with these drugs, that the sort of blunting effect that these drugs have on appetite may be more general than assumed and may negatively impact other areas of people's lives, despite the effectiveness of weight loss. So excuse the long quote here, but this is just too good. All right, okay? This is a really good one. And Hari says, quote, "When I asked Patricia Grigson, who had carried out the path-breaking work showing that GLP-1 agonists reduce the use of heroin and fentanyl in rats, about anhedonia, right, this loss of joy, she said, quote, I think it's a fundamental question, end quote. Your reward system makes you seek out all the things you need in life, like food and sex. Quote, it's important that we tend to our real needs with vigor. That's why I think it's important to figure out, to make sure that people taking these drugs are still tending to their real needs with vigor, end quote. But she added that your reward system goes beyond just meeting your basic needs. Quote, if you think about a triathlon or a marathoner or any who aspire to be the best at whatever we're engaging in, a person who wants to be the best violinist, these things take thousands and thousands of hours of motivation and energy. Are we going to have that? Are we going to interfere with that? If we interfere with that, we're in big trouble. Anhedonia is a possible scenario, she said, and she's concerned about it, end quote. Okay, I think that's great. I think that really hits the nail on the head. And that's, again, just like my concern about the subclinical levels of nutrient deficiencies, right? If we just blunt this drive just a little bit, right? And a good analogy that I would use is like testosterone, right? These days, you hear a whole bunch about testosterone. It's kind of funny because, when I was a teenager, I just thought it was odd that almost nobody talked about hormones. Like, hormones are so important. They're so powerful. And I shouldn't say that. Obviously, there were tons of people talking about hormones, but not normal people, right? Normal people didn't get their testosterone levels checked unless they were, I don't know, maybe bodybuilders, or they're 70, 80-year-old men, or they are suffering from something like erectile dysfunction. Normal people, just healthy, strapping young lads, no reason to check. Well, what people have determined and have figured out is that you can have somebody who just functions normally, they have a good job, they're with, their family, or they're in college, or, whatever the circumstances might be, and they're just a little off, right? Their energy is just a little low. They're just a little flatter. They don't see things with the same brightness that maybe other people do. And oftentimes when these individuals go get their testosterone levels checked, their testosterone levels are incredibly low. Incredibly low. Now, obviously, there's a flip of that. People that want these super physiological levels of testosterone for athletic performance and mental performance and maybe other performance. But to me, this is analogous, right? That you can have these subclinical levels, that it just blunts things just enough to turn sort of normal everyday functioning, the normal drive that we have as human beings to excel in the things that are important to us and to do, and it knocks that down a little bit. What's that worth? I don't know, right? These are questions that I think we just need to ask ourselves. There's one more. This one comes from Christian Hendershot. I guess he's a PhD in clinical psychology, and he has studied these drugs. And he says, quote, that definitely comes up. Some people do report an increase in negative mood, negative affect when they are taking these medications. I think there's a possibility that reward that's derived from natural sources could also be dampened. I think it's something to watch for. End quote. Again, from the perspective of the risk to the individual, the impact to the brain, this would be my number one concern. My number one concern. So Hari lays out these 10 risks. I get them. Not to say that they aren't worthy of strong consideration and assessment, but from where I'm sitting, those are the 3 that are running through my head. Just to recap, the risk of accelerating eating disorders. 2, the risk of nutrient deficiencies, in particular subclinical, slightly lower than optimal levels of nutrients. And 3, the risk of broader impacts to the brain, anhedonia, and suicidal thoughts. Okay, so those are the risks, at least from where I'm sitting right now, as I see them. Some of these are unknown. Does that mean that taking Ozempic isn't still worth it? Well, let's ask ourselves this question, knowing what we know now, and you probably have your own view at this point. But bottom line, should I take Ozempic for weight loss? We've talked benefits, we've talked risks, we've discussed how these drugs work. Should I take them? Should I take GLP-1 agonists for weight loss? Is Ozempic right for me, my family, somebody that I love, a friend? And I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. My own personal lean, my bias, if you will, is that non-pharmaceutical solutions are preferable. That being said, that's not a particularly strong statement, right? I think most people would probably prefer a non-pharmaceutical solution. And I will say that after reading Hari, my mind has been opened to, I think, a case for these drugs in some cases. Is it 47% of the adult American population, as has indicated in one study, would like to take these drugs or would be willing to pay for these drugs? No. Is it 20 to 30% of the population, as one expert suggested? I don't know. I think the number is probably much, much smaller. To me, the case where it makes the most sense would be in cases of severe obesity. And severe obesity where, a person is very, very acutely limited in their day-to-day activities. Right? Hari tells a story about a guy, I think it's one of the initial stories in the book, where there's a guy who, when the medical responders come to respond to a call to his house, he's physically so large they can't get him out of his house. They have to cut a hole in the wall. Okay, now in that situation, in that circumstance, yes, I think that these drugs are probably a very good alternative, very good option, assuming, none of the other things, right? No suicidal thoughts, no threat of eating disorders, no acute history or maybe even existing thyroid cancer. Yeah, probably in those situations, maybe there would be like gastric bypass surgery or something else would be the right move. However, in cases of severe obesity, or, maybe even there was another story of a guy who's just later in life, right? He's a guy who's, I think, in his 60s, and he's been overweight, bad knees, bad back, really having a hard time moving around. He goes on these medications. He loses a bunch of weight. He starts to get more active. He starts cycling. He starts enjoying life. And yeah, this guy's towards the end of his life, certainly in the last third. And yeah, I can see, is this guy necessarily going to make huge dietary and lifestyle intervention changes? Probably not. Not saying that he couldn't, but that calculus is much, much different than a 16-year-old kid. I mean, just much different in my opinion. Somebody who's going to be on these drugs for, maybe a couple of decades versus somebody who's really going to be on these drugs for their entire life. I think we should really, really pause there. And I'm not alone. I do know that Hari has the same view on this with respect to use in young people. And I think his standard is a little different than mine. I think he's kind of at the, if your BMI is maybe above 30, they're probably, it's something to consider. That seems a little low to me personally, but I also get it. Most of the time, people who are in this situation, as we've discussed, where they're considering these drugs, I mean, this is still a pretty steep price tag for many people. Yes, I know insurance covers it, but you've got deductibles, you've got copays. It's not like the whole thing is a free lunch. Plus, you're jabbing yourself with a needle, something most people don't like. And not to mention all the side effects, the obvious side effects, like you just feel nauseous for most people, right? A lot of people have gastrointestinal problems. So it's not like this is their first choice either. So I think we can assume that many have believed they have tried the diet and exercise thing. And I'm inclined to agree. I think most people have, right? They're not coming to Ozempic or an injectable weight loss solution as the first thing to try. I think that's fair to say. They've dealt with the shame, they've dealt with the judgment, they've dealt with the, polite suggestions. They've heard all the advice, and for whatever reason, it hasn't worked, or it's yo-yoed, right? And we're going to talk a lot about that next week. So again, for me, I think there are probably a small number of people that this makes sense for. It's probably smaller than what the drug companies would tell you, and it's certainly probably smaller than even what Hari would say. But that's my view on it. Now, is there a best case scenario? Is there a best case scenario for people who are on these drugs? And I think there is. I think there is a best case scenario here. And let's just say that you decide to move forward with a GLP-1 agonist. You decide that it's worth the risk, maybe after this podcast or after another podcast or just after, and again, I'll throw the plug out there for Magic Pill, after reading Magic Pill. And you say, yeah, I think it's worth it. I'm going to give it a shot. You decide to take Ozempic, Mounjaro, or even a next generation of these drugs. Here would be my unsolicited advice. It's not medical advice, as I said. It's friend advice. This is bro advice. My advice would be to take advantage of the massive crunch down that you will experience with your appetite, the super physiological feeling of satiety, to not simply eat less, but to eat better. Don't simply keep the same diet that got you into this place, but eat less of it. I know that's tempting. I know that's what a lot of people do. My advice, my strong, if I could snap my fingers and give you one thing and say, hey, just try it. What do you got to lose? Substitute those foods for nutrient-dense foods. From what I understand, a lot of the foods that you liked before, they're not going to taste the same. They're not going to have the same luster. You're not going to get that same feeling. So why not try something new? And I'm not saying, boiled chicken breast and broccoli every meal either. Okay. I am saying that there are tasty food options that can be discovered. But as I believe, and so many other people that have looked at this believe, the ultra-processed foods, these hyper-palatable foods, they are designed to be addictive. And because they are designed to be addictive and they are devoid of these nutrients, and again, I'll say it, that one of my key concerns here is these subclinical levels of nutrient deficiencies. Give it a shot. Substitute in those nutrient-dense foods. And I don't really care how you eat. If you're vegan, if you're carnivore, doesn't matter. There are nutrient-dense foods across the animal and plant kingdom. Find those foods. If you want me to make a list, let me know. I'll make a list. I can give you, here are my suggestions. Here are my thoughts based on how your ideal view of how you want to interface in the world is with your food. There are tons of choices. There are tons of options, but pick those nutrient-dense foods and give them a shot. Substitute them in. Because guess what? What if this is this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to substitute out this lifestyle that you had for a lifestyle that's sustainable, for a way of managing your energy and your ideal physique and all those things and your muscle mass? What if that were possible? And this was just this unbelievable opportunity that sort of fell into your lap. Why not take it like that? Why not assume that that would be possible, that that would be a best case scenario? So that would be my unsolicited advice. Again, not medical advice, bro advice. That's it. If I were going to counsel a loved one, that's what I would say to them. And again, no judgment from me. Zero, none, ever. Doesn't matter to me. You're a good person. Okay. If you're listening, you're a good person. You just need to know that. Okay. So that's it for me with respect to this topic of Ozempic. Hopefully we've covered some helpful considerations here, risks, benefits, potential rewards, both from a weight loss perspective, non-weight loss perspective. Hopefully you had some fun. I certainly know that I did. And maybe your mind's been changed a little bit, like mine has been. That, yeah, maybe there is a place. Maybe there are some people that this class of drugs really does make sense for, especially in the short term, especially if it's a short-term thing. I'll just keep plugging that. Which then leads me to the next obvious thing. if these drugs aren't right for everybody, or maybe if you're just like, hey, these things are early, maybe I do want to give it some time. Maybe I tried the diet and exercise thing. Maybe I could have done it a little differently. Or maybe when you say things like whole foods or nutrient dense foods, I never really thought about it like that. If anything is giving you pause, and I think that's fair, right? I mean, these drugs are new. There's a lot of unknowns here. And if Ozempic is not right for everyone, is there another option? Is there an alternative to GLP-1 agonists? Is there a way to lose weight, to feel better, to enhance your energy levels, your physique in a drug-free manner? And I believe there is. And as I said, Hari has it all here in this book, Magic Pill. It's not laid out linearly. It's not like that. But I have pulled out those breadcrumbs, right? I am drawing those connections as we speak. But that's where I want to pick up next week. So rather than just sort of throwing stones from my glass house and saying, I don't think these drugs are right for everybody, there's another way. Yeah, maybe. And that's where we're going to pick up next week. We're going to talk about why diets fail. We're going to talk about why exercise might not help you lose weight. What? I know. Crazy to think. You still should exercise, though, but it might not help you lose weight, or at least that's what some people think. We're going to talk rats eating cheesecake. We're going to talk about Japan. Japan is the only country to become wealthy without getting fat, and we're going to talk about how they did it. And we're going to talk a little bit about my own personal journey of how I was able to get lean and how I am able to stay lean, despite being a chubby kid, despite having periods of time in my adult life where I was overweight, and why I believe I have something to say on the subject that might be of help, that might be of service to some people. I'll leave you with that thought until next week. Again, thank you for the listen. Oh, and I'd love to have you as a subscriber. Consider subscribing to the show and take a second to rate the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to the show. It won't cost you a thing, and you'll never miss an episode. Doing so will also help me build this show into what I know it can be. These topics are hugely important. I've said this before, maybe among the most important topics we have to think about as a species, and your support would really mean a lot to me. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.